Good morning, everyone. We have gathered here today in the meditation hall to learn and be inspired by the vast knowledge of Dr. Ramesh Bijlani ji, who has been associated with the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. Dr. Bijlani was a professor at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, when he started coming to the ashram in 1992. His visits here led to his establishing at AIMS in the year 2000 a patient care facility for providing lifestyle modification courses based on yoga. In 2005, he took voluntary retirement to find more time to spend here at the ashram and to be with Sri Aurobindo and Mother's teachings. Soon after taking retirement, he moved to the ashram, Delhi branch, where he's now been living and working since 2005. He is an inspirational speaker, a writer. He has more than 25 books and more than 250 blogs on the Speaking Tree, if you know the Speaking Tree, website to his credit. His books include those related to wellness, nutrition, yoga, spirituality, and education, besides a large number of educational books for children. So without any further delay, I would request Dr. Bijlani to speak to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini, for a generous introduction. My dear brothers and sisters, I'm supposed to speak something to you, but I'm not sure if communication through words is the most important thing for us to achieve our goal. What's our goal? To bring the best out of us. You might have observed that something like that is your resolve to be the best version of yourself, started happening long back when you started coming to the precincts of this ashram because of various things related to the admission of your child. And then this morning itself you might have felt a different sort of a feeling coming over you as soon as you entered the gate of the ashram, the precincts of the ashram. And then when you settled here and heard the music which the mother would have once played on the organ in Pondicherry, you would have felt as if you have been transported to another world altogether. And the vibrations of the relics of Sri Aurobindo, which are just there, and it's the compulsions of the necessity of the thing that I'm keeping my back towards those relics. But you all have your front and can have your inspiration from there. So in fact, words are not necessary for achieving the goal that all of us have, because if you are the best version of yourself, you will be also automatically the best of parents, and your children will get what best they can get from you. But all the same, being a human with our limitations, we sometimes make these concessions and try to formulate in words things which may not be absolutely necessary. Just as you know, as a medical doctor, I know that we have self-healing mechanisms in the body which can take care of most of our illnesses, and where they can't, even doctors can't do much. But all the same, as a concession to our normal mode of thinking and feeling, we do go to a doctor, and then if we get something which we can swallow, we feel that, well, I've done something concrete, something material has gone into my body, now this will fix me. I'll be all right again. But we don't realize that even without that, we would have got all right on our own anyway. So it is one of those concessions, similar concessions that we are making when I'm speaking to you. Let me start with congratulating all of you on your child having got admitted to the Mothers International School, which is one of the best schools in the country. And it's the dream of many parents. Unfortunately, not everybody's child. All those parents who want their child to be here can be here. And the solution is that we should have more and more schools of this type in the country. That would be the dream that all of us have, and it may materialize in not too distant a future, because we should take a little look at also the futuristic vision of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother about their having not only foreseen but also assured us of a much better place, a much better world in the very near future. So orientation first should be to the system of education that we follow here. That system we call integral education. And even if you do not know much about what integral education is, you would have guessed that it will be a system in which there will be a great emphasis on values and morals and so on, and that's how it makes the child who goes through education in this school turns out to be different at the end of 12 or 13 or 14 years, whatever your child will stay here. At the end of that period, the child will be a different type of person. And our usual idea of values and morals being taught in schools is that the child would be told repeatedly what to do, what not to do, what are nice things to do and what are bad things to do. In integral education, the core of the whole thing is not actually sermonizing, moralizing. We have no textbook on moral education, and we have no fixed period on moral education. And certainly we don't conduct an exam in which we ask the children questions about morality. None of that happens. Because if you really think about it a little more, you'll realize that the child already knows what is good or bad. बच्चे को तो पहले ही पता है. और इसीलिए अगर बच्चा कोई गलत काम करता है तो आपसे छिपाने की कोशिश करता है. ऐसे टाइम पे करने की कोशिश करता है जब आप देख ना रहे हो. तो व्हाई डज द चाइल्ड डू दैट? क्योंकि बच्चे को पता है कि ये गलत काम है. तो हम कौन होते हैं बताने वाले कि क्या ठीक और क्या गलत है? बट एट सेम टाइम फिर भी गलत काम करता क्यों है? अगर पता है तो छिपाना भी पड़ता है. डर भी होता है कि अगर पता चल गया तो सज़ा मिल सकती है. फिर भी क्यों करता है? बिकॉज ईविल कैन बी टेम्पटिंग. ईविल हैज़ अ सर्टन शॉर्ट टर्म थ्रिल एसोसिएटेड विद इट. बच्चों के लिए भी, बड़ों के लिए भी. बड़े भी करते हैं, कई गलत काम करते हैं, और इसीलिए करते हैं बिकॉज द टेम्पटेशन इज़ देयर, टेम्पटेशन ऑफ अ डिफरेंट टाइप, मे बी टेम्पटेशन टू सेव सम मनी, whatever. So उसके लिए गलत काम करते हैं. But temptations जो है वो the evil has that tendency to tempt us, and for that we are willing to take a little risk and do something which we know basically is not right. And the fact is that not only we do it, what we expect from it also very often happens. Suppose income tax बचाने के लिए रिटर्न में कुछ गड़बड़ कर दी, गलत लिख दिया, तो एक्चुअली पैसा बच जाता है, बैंक बैलेंस में फ़र्क पड़ता है, समथिंग कॉन्क्रीट डज हैपन, और कुछ होता भी नहीं है. वी ऑल्सो एस्केप. द चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट कैन टेल अस इनफ ट्रिक्स टू नॉट गेट कॉट, एंड ऑल्सो गिव्स अस द एश्योरेंस, फिक्र मत करो, सारे ही करते हैं, कुछ नहीं होगा. सो ही गिव्स यू दैट एश्योरेंस, ही टीचेस यू. नाउ when that happens, do you really get totally assured that nothing will happen? फिर भी पूरा assurance नहीं मिलता. मन में कभी न कभी थोड़ा खटका होता है कि शायद कुछ हो जाएगा, शायद पकड़ा जाऊं. Now, feeling that and think of all the wrong things that we may do, and feeling repeatedly bad about them, and this sort of feeling accumulating inside, what is its effect on us? Every time you think of such a thing, तो आपको लगेगा कि ये सिर्फ एक फीलिंग नहीं है. Our body and mind are, and this something which is coming from within, which is making us feel कि कुछ गलत किया है. That just that feeling, without necessarily going into any reasons or consequences, this just feeling of uneasiness has its impact even on our body. At that time, you start feeling a little weak. You feel as if energy has been drained out of you. And if this keeps happening repeatedly, ultimately it may start telling in the form of some chronic disease also, physical disease. So that's how the stress gets related to illnesses. In fact, now it's considered to be the number one contributor to almost just about every disease. Because basically we are geared for health, not for disease. And still we do fall ill so often. And that happens primarily because of the imbalance between our surface instruments, that is the body and the mind, and our inner self, or our divine essence, generally called the soul. It's that imbalance between different parts of the being that is at the root of all illnesses. Germs and all that are fine. Germ is a necessary sort of a contributor to the disease, but it's not a sufficient contributor. Germs तो चारों तरफ हर समय हैं, लेकिन हर वक्त तो हम बीमार नहीं रहते, विच मीन्स कि हमारी बॉडी में इतनी इम्यूनिटी है कि उनके साथ डील कर सके. इम्यूनिटी कब वीक होती है? व्हेन वी आर अंडर स्ट्रेस. इसीलिए तो बच्चों को भी बुखार ज़्यादा तभी होता ना जब एग्ज़ाम पास आ रहा हो. तो स्ट्रेस इज रिलेटेड टू just about every illness, including infectious disease, which we think is because of a germ. But germ is only one of the necessary contributors, but not a sufficient contributor. In fact, शुरू में जब germ theory आई थी, तो some people didn't believe it, and to challenge it, one person said, "You give me a bottle full of germs, artificial culture करते हैं ना लैब में, तो एक पानी जैसा सोल्यूशन उसमें जर्म्स होते हैं. उसने कहा मुझे दो, एंड ही ड्रैंक इट अप एंड नथिंग हैपेंड बिकॉज ही वॉज कॉन्फिडेंट कि कुछ नहीं होगा. सो इफ यू थिंक नथिंग विल हैपन, नथिंग एक्चुअली हैपन्स. इट इज एज नथिंग हैपन्स. सी, नथिंग हैपन, सो द जर्म इज नॉट द कॉज ऑफ द डायरिया विच यू आर टॉकिंग अबाउट. ही डिडंट गेट डायरिया. शिगेला का कल्चर पी गया. सो दैट्स नाउ what relevance does it have to education? The relevance to education is that बच्चे को सिर्फ ये कॉन्शियस करना है कि ठीक क्या है गलत क्या है, उसके लिए गाइड हमारे अंदर है. दैट गाइड इज आवर डिवाइन एसेंस, एंड सिंस इट्स द डिवाइन एसेंस, ईश्वर का तत्व है, तो ईश्वर को सब कुछ मालूम है. जिसको सब कुछ मालूम है उसको ये बताने में देर नहीं लगती कि क्या ठीक है क्या गलत है. हमें जो ज़्यादा सोचना पड़ता है, रीज़न में जाना पड़ता है क्या ठीक है क्या गलत है, बिकॉज आवर मेंटल फैकल्टीज आर लिमिटेड. सो वी नीड दैट क्रच ऑफ रीजनिंग. लेकिन जिसको सब कुछ पता है उसको उसकी ज़रूरत नहीं है. तो इसलिए अंदर से जो आवाज़ आती है कि क्या ठीक और क्या गलत है, आवाज़ हम यूज़ कर रहे हैं जस्ट इन अ फिगरेटिव सेंस. इट्स नॉट दैट एक्चुअली स्पीक्स, बट अंदर से जो आवाज़ आती है कि क्या ठीक है क्या गलत है, बिकॉज इट कमिंग फ्रॉम दैट सोर्स विच नोज एवरीथिंग, उसको बताने में देर नहीं लगती. इट्स अ वेरी क्विक वॉइस. और बिकॉज इट इज़ वेरी श्योर, बिकॉज ऑफ द टोटल नॉलेज, उसमें क्लैरिटी भी बहुत होती है, बहुत स्पष्ट होती है, उसमें कोई संदेह नहीं होता. इट लीव्स नो रूम फॉर एनी डाउट्स एंड क्वेश्चंस. बट द ओनली थिंग इज वी आर सो कॉन्स्टिट्यूटेड दैट इट इज़ अ फेंट वॉइस. मंद सी आवाज़ होती है, धीमी सी. इट्स अ शाई वॉइस एंड इट्स अ नॉन असर्टिव वॉइस. ये आवाज़ जिद नहीं करती. एक बार बोल दिया फिर अपनी मर्जी है, जो मर्जी कर लो. इट डज नॉट इंसिस्ट. इट्स दैट टाइप ऑफ वॉइस. ऑन द अदर हैंड, व्हेन देयर इज अ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट बिटवीन दिस वॉइस एंड द वॉइस ऑफ द इमोशनल पार्ट ऑफ द बीइंग और द इंटेलेक्ट, दैट्स व्हाट द माइंड बेसिकली इज. वन पार्ट एसोसिएटेड विद फीलिंग एंड वन विद थिंकिंग. तो वहाँ की जो आवाज़ आती है वो बहुत शोर मचाती है. एंड व्हेन इट इज़ इन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट, it doesn't always have to be in conflict, but when it is in conflict, then this voice coming from the emotional part of the being and the intellect which works through reasons convinces us that this is the right thing to do, although it is the wrong thing to do. So it is in conflict with that inner voice, but convinces us, and because it is persistent, it is loud, it is recurrent, the shy and faint voice of that inner being gets lost. So the child has to be made aware that the inner guide is there. Secondly, what the child should become aware of is that this inner guide is always correct, and the listening to it or not listening to it has consequences. What are the consequences of listening to this voice? Joy and lasting mental peace. For example, suppose someone does not hide the income, CHI कितने भी assurance दे दे, उसको बोलता है कि नहीं, मुझे गलत काम नहीं करना, मेरा रिटर्न जो है ठीक तरह से भर दो. So, when he says that, that time itself he feels strong. He feels that energy has entered into his body. And then when the return goes, he thinks, I've done the right thing, and that gives the sense of joy. And I will not be caught, that gives lasting mental peace. So the reward of doing the right thing is immense joy and lasting mental peace. That is something which we all want. We are calling it joy, not happiness, because it goes beyond happiness. You see, feeling good can be of two types. One is when we get something, the other is when we give something. Both can give us happiness. Now, when we get something, like say a new dress or a new car, whatever it is, it gives us some happiness, but then that is short lasting. Because very soon we realize that it does not bring as much happiness as we expected. We also realize it has some tax, you may call it, or some drawbacks associated with it, which we had not foreseen. And another thing that happens is we get saturated with it. We get used to it, and then it doesn't give us that same thrill anymore, just becomes a part of life. Now, all these things happen, and then it doesn't mean that all our desires end. Then we get a new desire and we start working towards that. So this goes on. So the happiness that we get from getting something, the fulfillment of a desire, has limitations. On the other hand, when you give something, that firstly doesn't have the limitation of fulfilling or not fulfilling. Because we can't get everything we want, but we can always give anything we want. Secondly, it gives us a type of happiness which has a different feel. So suppose you are on a flight on which meals are not normally served. And you didn't bring anything from home either. Now food is available on sale. Suppose you find that a sandwich that costs 200 rupees. Maybe even more these days, one never knows. Anything is possible. So, you feel 200 rupees is too much for a sandwich. On the other hand, you feel that I'm hungry. Now, also there's a temptation that maybe the sandwich will be very good. If it is costing that much, it will be very good. So, after toying with all the plus and minus points, finally suppose you end up buying the sandwich. It gives a certain type of happiness. On the other hand, you feel that it is not just money. I should not be spending so much money on this. This much money can buy a meal for maybe 4 people. Even these days, sometimes you might have seen in some dhabas, they write 3-4 combinations like kadi chawal and rajma and this and that. Some 2-3 combinations like that, 50 rupees combination. So I can feed 4 people like that, with that, a full meal. And nothing will happen to me. I can take it like a fast. Fasting doesn't have to be only as a ritual on some special days. So today can be my day of fasting. Nothing will happen, so I'll not have. And then, after you get down from the flight at the nearest, closest opportunity, you actually find 4 hungry people and you feed them 50 rupees per head. So you did not save money. You spent the same money which you would have spent on the sandwich, and at the same time, you have not got the sandwich. You spent the money, you didn't get the sandwich. But how do you feel? The happiness that you get now is what is joy. The happiness you get from the sandwich is ordinary happiness, a fleeting pleasure. Now, on the other hand, suppose you actually buy the sandwich and you say, well, I can feed those 4 people also and I can also have the sandwich. Doesn't have the same feeling. मैं तो दोनों ही काम कर सकता हूँ. चलो idea आया तो कभी खिला भी दूंगा. Now if you do that, it will not be the same. So there's a difference between the two. So it has consequences. And on the other hand, suppose you buy the sandwich and don't do even anything to feed anybody. Then what happens? Then I got an idea, I could have done something better, but I didn't do it. That creates a little sense of guilt and some uneasiness. So the consequences of not listening to this inner voice is guilt and recurrent uneasiness. एक आत्मग्लानि, अंदर से बुरा फील करना और बार बार कभी कभी खटका होते रहना. So the child also has to realize that there are consequences of listening or not listening to this inner guide, because, and in fact in general in children the guide is far more open, far more amenable to acting upon than in adults. Children are basically by and large much better than we are. They know what is good and bad, just needs a little reinforcement, and they have to realize that yes, this what I'm getting from inside has a value, and the consequences, there are consequences of listening or not listening to this voice. And the child also wants, like us, that joy and lasting mental peace, in contrast with feeling guilty and a sense of uneasiness which keeps recurring. The child also doesn't want that. Now, why this is important is because much of crime in the world thrives exactly on this. Because in the ordinary way of looking at morality, the conditioning quite often is that if we do something wrong, we'll get punished. And therefore, if we do something which we can in some way justify also through some sort of reasoning, then it's okay. We can do those wrong things. And so long as nobody finds out that we are not punished, it's okay. You know, for example, not paying enough tax. One can find enough reasons for it. Everybody does it. एक मेरे ना करने से क्या फ़र्क पड़ेगा? सरकार के पास बहुत पैसा है, सरकार वैसे ही पैसा बहुत वेस्ट करती है, इससे तो अच्छा मैं चैरिटी में दे दूं सरकार को देने की बजाय. Can find 100 reasons for not doing it. So reasons भी मिल जाते हैं, but all the same, the sense of that uneasiness does not disappear with all these reasons. So reasons कई मिल जाते हैं. And the fact is that we can also escape punishment, because the amount of crime that is actually detected is only a small fraction of the crime that is committed. And the crime that is punished is a still smaller fraction of the crime that is detected. That's a fact of the world, real fact. So, which means that if somebody does something wrong, thinking that I'm doing it so cleverly that I'll never be found out, and I also have justification in terms of reasoning for that wrong thing, then the calculation of that person does work out, the person does not get punished. But then, what does the person escape? The person escapes punishment from outside, from the law. Legal punishment he escapes. But the person does not escape the punishment which comes from within. So the child also has to realize that it's not to please the parents that I have to do the right thing. It's not to please the teacher that I have to do the right thing. I have to do the right thing for my own interest. Because it gives me a certain joy, it gives me lasting mental peace. If I don't do it, then I'll get, in contrast, uneasiness, which will be recurrent in nature. So it's not to please somebody that I have to do it. Because that now the child knows it's not to please somebody that I have to avoid doing something wrong or to escape punishment. I have to do it because doing something wrong leads to a punishment which nobody can escape. So this is what integral education is about, and this is what we call psychic education. Why psychic? Because this comes from our divine essence, which is the soul, and the soul has a static aspect and a dynamic aspect. The static aspect is like a witness. It's just observing. It doesn't participate in day-to-day life. But it also has a dynamic aspect which puts in this word at the right moment. This dynamic aspect is what Sri Aurobindo and the mother call the psychic being. So that's why this aspect is called the psychic education. And in integral education, psychic education is not just a component of education, it is the pivot around which the rest of education revolves. Now, what is the rest of education? The rest of the education is about the three surface instruments. These three surface instruments are the body, that the body has to be educated. Education of the body doesn't just mean making it physically fit through games and sports. Education of the body also means making the person conscious of the bodily movements. Let's perform those movements consciously. Make those movements graceful and harmonious and well coordinated. And the ability to be able to balance the body properly, carry the body properly. Now, all that is a part of physical education. Then, emotional part of the being. Education of the emotional part of the being is also important because while it may look that emotions are what tempt us towards doing something wrong, so if at all any education is needed, the emotions should be suppressed and killed, which is what many religious and spiritual traditions guide us towards. But in fact, emotions don't have to be killed, emotions have to be educated. Why? Because emotions are not there just to lead us astray, to tempt us for wrongdoing. Emotions are also behind everything great and worthwhile that we do. कोई भी बड़ा काम करते हैं तो उसके लिए जुनून की ज़रूरत होती है, क्योंकि उसमें कई मुश्किलें आएंगी, बाधाएं आएंगी, तकलीफ़ें होंगी. वो सब उठाने के लिए हिम्मत तभी आती है क्योंकि हमारे अंदर एक जुनून है, हम वो करना चाहते हैं, इसीलिए करते हैं. सो इमोशंस आर नॉट रिडंडेंट, emotions have a great value, and all vitality and enthusiasm and passion and dedication that we have, a commitment that we develop towards a cause, is because of emotions. और बड़े बड़े काम तो छोड़िए, even another very ordinary thing which most of us end up doing is also because of emotions, because in the larger scheme of things, in the divine scheme, that also is an important and worthwhile activity. And what is that? Getting married and having children. सबको नज़र आता है चारों तरफ देखें तो कि शादी की वजह से तो मुश्किलें हैं ही हैं, बच्चों की वजह से और मुश्किल बढ़ जाती है, अच्छे स्कूल में दाखिल कराना इतना मुश्किल हो जाता है. So many problems, and still most of us do end up getting married and having children. Why? Because nature has heavily overloaded us with this emotion, and so that's also coupled with emotions. So emotions are behind everything great and worthwhile that we do, including having children. So that's also a great thing. To have children and to bring them up well is not an ordinary thing just because everybody does it. Because that is what creates the future. And that is why it has also been coupled with emotions, so that we will do it. So emotions also need to be educated, they don't have to be killed. And what does that mean? Means the education of emotions means purification of emotions, refinement of emotions, and eventually transformation of emotions. What is transformation? The emotional part of the being starts speaking a language which is the same as the language of the soul. Because after all, what is the emotional part of the being looking for? Happiness. And if listening to that voice gives us the best version of happiness, which we call joy, and it also gives us lasting mental peace, then why should the emotional part of the being not speak the same language as the soul? That is the transformation. So that is what eventually education should work at. So the child realizes that yes, it is not a sin to be happy, but what is it that I am finding happiness in? Where should I look for happiness? That is what is important. Everybody wants to be happy. The main difference between one set of human beings and another is where they find their happiness. So that's why emotional part of the being also needs to be educated. Then the intellect. Of course, that we all accept. It's basically for education of the intellect. We think we have to go to school. But then that can also be different. And the difference which you will find here is that we are not developing just the lowest faculty of the intellect, that is memory, but we are in fact emphasizing more the other faculties of the intellect which are higher than that. What is higher than the memory is understanding what we have learnt. And what is higher than understanding is application. We should be able to apply what we know. And even higher than application is critical thinking, curiosity, the ability to formulate a question properly, to be able to analyze a situation properly, to be able to summarize when we have to be able to elaborate upon something when we have to, and finally, to be able to use the faculty of reasoning properly. Now, these are also higher faculties of the intellect. And these are the faculties which we need for actually living a life based on rationality, on the refined version of rationality, on the best version of rationality, and these are also the faculties which we need for generation of new knowledge. Research does not happen just because we know a lot. It's not knowing a lot of facts which leads to worthwhile research. It is the ability to ask a good question and to be able to formulate a good project which will answer that question, which leads to generation of new knowledge. That does not require knowing more and more facts. So that is, intellect has to be educated. But then what is the use of all this educating the body, the emotional part of the being and the intellect, which Sri Aurobindo in the mother's terminology we call the physical, vital and the mental. Physical is the body, vital is the emotions. Why vital? Because they are vital, as we saw just now. They are necessary in life, including continuation of the world and continuation of ourselves. Hunger has also been associated with emotions. When a person is hungry, the person is miserable. When we get food, we feel happy. So, because that is a necessity to maintain the individual. So, maintenance of the individual, maintenance of the species, and the other worthwhile things that human beings do, they are all coupled to emotions, and therefore emotions are vital. So, the physical, vital, and the mental is what they use generally for the intellect. The education of the physical, vital, and mental should revolve around the psychic being, which means that we are trying to make the child use these instruments, because the body and the mind are basically instruments for action. In everything that we do, we use a combination of the body and the mind. So the instruments should function under the guidance of that inner voice coming from the psychic being. So the psychic being forms the center, the pivot. And why that is important? Because improving the function of the instruments alone is not enough. For example, a knife is also an instrument. We can use the same knife for chopping fruits and vegetables, and we can also use it for stabbing somebody. In the same way, just think about a terrorist. A terrorist who is physically unfit, emotionally unstable, and intellectually dull. Will he be able to launch a successful terrorist attack? वो भी नहीं कर पाएगा, पकड़ा जाएगा. Now suppose that person goes through a system of education in which he becomes physically strong, emotionally stable, and intellectually sharp. So all the three instruments have been educated properly. Now the performance of these instruments has improved enormously. That improves his chances of becoming a successful terrorist. So now if a system of education can help a terrorist as much as it can help a teacher or a doctor or a manager or a scientist, then that can't be a good system of education. Because even a doctor, manager or a scientist or a teacher, they also use a combination of body and mind. So you improve the functioning of the body and the mind, all these jobs a person will be able to do well. But then a terrorist also using a combination of body and mind. So if you educate his instruments, he'll do that job better. But then that is not be a good system of education. What makes the system of education good is that the child should not only be able to use the instruments better, the child should also know how to use the instruments. And a child who has understood that you have to you have that inner guide which tells you what is right and wrong and it has consequences, will not become a terrorist. That is why we need that. That is why we need to bring the soul into education. That is why we have to not only bring the soul in, we have to make it the pivot around which the education of the instruments revolves. So that is the center. So that's why I spent that much time on it, because psychic education is not the fourth component as sometimes people feel. Physical, vital, mental, and the fourth component is psychic. Psychic is not the fourth component. Psychic is the center. It's the pivot. And that is why it does not require a separate period. The teacher has to be conscious and the parents to be conscious throughout all the time that this is also something which the child has to learn, for which what do we have to do? We don't have to tell it the way I am telling you. For the child appropriate methods are that you exploit a situation in which this principle can be brought out by the child himself or herself. You ask questions at appropriate times which will engineer in the child a reflection which will lead to this discovery. You tell stories in which this is inbuilt, and the story can be told in such a way that you are interrupting the story at the appropriate points and asking the child some questions which will engineer this type of a reflection. Now that is the method to do it. So throughout you will see there is no moralizing. Those days are gone. Even if you told a story, there was a time when पूछते थे बच्चों तुमने इस कहानी से क्या सीखा? Those days are gone. We don't have to do that. That doesn't work. And at the same time, if you tell them what to do, what not to do, a list of do's and don'ts, that works even less. So what works is the child has to internalize the message, feel as if I have derived this myself, and just internalize it. Formulating in words, it's not important. It is the message which is important, the concept which is important, not being able to express it in words. So that is what essentially this system of education is about. Now just a few things, other things. One is that Sri Aurobindo and the mother have talked about the evolution in progress. We all know evolution. From a spiritual angle, it's a little different, but we'll not get into what is the difference. But that basically, initially there was no life on the planet, then came life, then within living creatures came first the plants, then the animals, and within animals, human being is the latest product. But if we go by the trend, there's no reason to assume that human being is the final product, which means creatures better than man may come. But then in what respect will they be better? The way they'll be better is they'll express more of the hidden divinity. Anything which has life expresses more of the hidden divinity than matter does. A stone does not express as much as even a germ which is living. Because the difference basically, both are basically divine, but the stone is not able to expresses hardly anything. A germ is expressing something. So anything which has life expresses more. So the creature which comes after human beings will express it even more. But then what is the difference between human beings and animals? The difference is that human beings themselves have the urge to evolve, to express more of that hidden divinity. They have that urge hidden within them, and they also have the capacity to satisfy that urge. That is what distinguishes human beings. So, which means that if this is the trend of evolution, human beings can contribute to that process by working towards their own evolution. They can accelerate the process of evolution. And the result would be that eventually there will be more and more people in the world who will be at a higher level of consciousness or who will express more of that hidden divinity. Now, so far the evolution has been a slow process. But firstly, human beings can accelerate it. Secondly, in terms of the history of the planet, Sri Aurobindo and the mother visualized that we have reached a point where mental consciousness has reached more or less its peak. And now we are poised for the next leap in evolution, which will lead to a significantly greater expression of divinity, which will be expressed by changing the very human nature. Not by making the human more intelligent in the way we look at it, that the intellect has reached more or less its peak, but now the expression will be in terms of changing human nature itself, which means human beings will become better human beings. Now, the fact that it is possible, we know because it has happened to a select few throughout history in all parts of the world. Those are our saints and rishis and sages and so on. But that has been a rare phenomenon. With the new leap in evolution, it will become more commonplace phenomenon. And if a large number of people are behaving better, the world itself will become a better place to live in, because after all, we constitute the world. Our behavior is what determines what type of world we'll have. So, what it means in this present context, the way I'm talking to you today, is that there will be more and more children born who will usher in that new world which they have visualized. And therefore, you should not be surprised. I mean, when Sri Aurobindo and Mother talked about it 100 years ago, it looked like fantasy. Now more and more people are finding a lot of evidences that it is actually happening. I'll not go into that again because it's not enough time, but what those evidences are. But what is most relevant is one of the evidences is that children are asking deep existential questions at a very young age. So if your child starts asking questions like कि ये संसार कैसे शुरू हुआ, यहाँ मैं क्यों आया हूँ, मेरे को जीवन में क्या करना है, सिर्फ खेलने और खाने के सिवा कुछ और भी क्या लक्ष्य है जीवन का. If the child starts asking some such questions, don't get surprised. If the child starts doing some weird things like talking to a plant or talking to an animal or even talking to a stone, don't get surprised. You know, कोई ज़माना था जब अगर कोई बच्चा कोई ऐसा काम करे, पत्थर के साथ बातें करना शुरू करे, तो हम कहें कि इसका शायद चेक कराना पड़ेगा, दिमाग में कोई प्रॉब्लम है शायद. But not necessarily. The child can see the divinity in that stone, and that's why the child thinks that I can talk to even a stone, appreciate a stone if it looks very beautiful, a beautiful round stone. If I appreciate it, maybe the stone will perceive somehow that I'm appreciating the stone. Now, if the child thinks so, the child doesn't need a medical checkup. You'll see more and more children of that type. So that is one warning that you should have. Just because we didn't think so, we didn't do so, or in our times it was not considered normal, doesn't mean that it is not normal. More and more children of that type will be born. Secondly, the second shock will come another maybe 10 years later, when it is time to choose a career. Again, the traditional way of thinking about a career has been to find a job which gives more money for less work, more money the better, and if along with that there's also prestige and power and associated, so much the better. And if there's stability and security, to aur kya chahiye? Now these were the criteria for choosing a career. But if your child says that I'm not interested in any of these, I do want to make a living, I do want some money, but not necessarily too much money, for my basic needs, what I want is a career which will give me an inner satisfaction. What I want is a career which will make me do something for the world. I want to do something which will change the world for the better. I want to make a difference to the world. If a child says that I want that type of a career, don't be surprised. Don't come in the child's way. It is natural, it is normal, such things will happen. More and more. And between you and me itself, there's more than a generation gap. So maybe, you can relate to this better than I can. In some of you might have chosen your careers in that fashion, because it's not that only your children will do it and you did not do it. Some of you might have done it. But then, on the whole, this type of choices, career choices will increase. This type of criteria being used by young people for making a career choice will increase. Another shock may come another 10 years later when the child has to choose a partner. Again, the criteria could be quite different. So, these are major events in life, and at all these points, the generation gap is not only widening, it is becoming qualitatively different. See, earlier, the generation gap meant when the child is a teenager, the child may want to have long hair, you want to have child have short hair, the child wants short hair, you want the child to have long hair, or you want the child to dress up in a certain way, that the child insists on dressing up the way everybody else is dressing up. All those conflicts. Now, these days, some of those conflicts are still there, but the type of conflicts have changed. There has been a qualitative shift. Earlier, the conflict was not so much about choosing a career. The conflict was not because the child is asking weird questions. That was not the type of conflicts which were very common. Now they are becoming more and more common. So these are some of the things which I thought were relevant to you.